A poor boy rescued a baby from an overturned car, but when he took the child to the mansion, he was treated as a suspect. When the millionaire finally understood what he had done, his eyes filled with tears. Malik woke up to the familiar buzzing of his alarm. He rubbed his eyes, the room still dim in the early morning light. He glanced over at his younger siblings, all still asleep, huddled under the mismatched blankets. He had to get up before them. That was the deal. He had to help before his mom left for work. "Malik, you awake?" His mother's voice called out from the kitchen, her tone tired. She always sounded like that now, worn out from long shifts. "Yeah, Ma, I'm up," Malik answered, getting out of bed quickly. He walked over to the dresser, pulling on his faded t-shirt and shorts. He moved through the narrow hallway, the walls close enough to touch with both hands. The air smelled like the coffee his mom always brewed to get her through her double shifts. He found her in the kitchen, wrapping a scarf around her head, her uniform already on. "Can you make sure they eat something before school?" she asked, gesturing toward the pantry. There wasn't much. Malik nodded, glancing at the shelves. A half loaf of bread, a few eggs, a carton of milk that felt too light. He forced a smile. "Got it, Ma. Don't worry about it." He kissed her cheek, and she gave him a tired smile before grabbing her bag. "Love you, Malik," she said, looking at him seriously. "You're a good boy. Don't forget it, okay?" "Love you too, Ma. We'll be fine." He watched her leave, the door clicking shut behind her. He turned back to the pantry, staring at what was left, calculating. He grabbed the bread and the milk, knowing he'd have to make it stretch. His siblings woke up one by one. He heard them shuffling around in the other room, rubbing their eyes, murmuring in half-sleep. Malik worked quickly, toasting the bread, pouring the last of the milk into cups, and adding water to make it enough for everyone. "Morning, Malik." His sister Amina yawned as she entered the kitchen. She was only 8, her hair a mess, her eyes still half-closed. "Morning. Sit down. I got breakfast." He pushed a plate toward her, giving her the bigger piece of toast. His little brother, Kareem, followed, still dragging his blanket behind him. They ate in relative silence, the sound of crunching toast and slurping milk filling the small room. Malik kept an eye on the clock, knowing he had to get them ready and out the door on time. The pressure sat in his chest, a constant reminder that he couldn't let his mom down. Not today. Not ever. Once they were dressed and ready, he walked them to school. The street was busy with old cars honking and rumbling along. The neighbors sat on their porches, some chatting, some just staring out. It wasn't much, but it was their world. He gave Amina and Kareem quick hugs at the school gate before heading back home, his mind already shifting to the next problem. The electric bill. The paper was still on the door where his mum had left it. The red letters were hard to ignore. Final notice. He pulled it down, folding it carefully and shoving it into his pocket. They couldn't afford to have the lights cut off. Not with his siblings at home. He had to figure something out. Malik walked down the street, hands in his pockets, eyes scanning for any opportunity. He knew most of the people in the neighborhood, and they knew him. A couple of them would let him do odd jobs, cleaning yards, carrying groceries. He just needed one of them to need something today, something that paid, even a little. "Yo, Malik," a voice called out. It was Mr. Johnson sitting on his porch, a cigarette hanging from his lips. "Hey, Mr. Johnson," Malik replied, walking over. "You need any help today? Yard work? Anything?" Mr. Johnson shook his head, blowing out a puff of smoke. "Not today, kid. Sorry. I already had someone come by yesterday." Malik nodded, trying not to let the disappointment show. "All right. Let me know if you need anything." He kept walking, the weight of the folded bill in his pocket growing heavier. He asked a few more people, but the answer was always the same. Nothing today. He found himself near the intersection, where the main road cut through the neighborhood. He watched the cars pass by, feeling a mix of frustration and helplessness. He had to figure something out. He couldn't let his mum come home to a dark house, not after everything she did for them. A loud screech broke his thoughts. Malik's head snapped up. He saw it, a car spinning out of control, tires skidding, the deafening sound of metal crunching as it flipped over, landing on its roof. Time seemed to slow. People screamed. A few ran toward the wreck, but most stood frozen. Malik's heart pounded. He heard something else then, a different sound. A baby's cry, faint but clear. It was coming from the car. He didn't think. He just moved. His feet pounded the pavement as he ran toward the overturned car. He could see through the shattered windows, a baby strapped in a car seat crying, its tiny face red and terrified. The driver, a woman, was slumped forward, unconscious. "Help!" Malik yelled to the onlookers, but no one came closer. They just watched. Malik swallowed hard, his hands trembling as he grabbed the door handle. It was stuck. He pulled harder, feeling the metal cut into his palm. Come on," he muttered, his voice shaking. Finally, the door gave way, and he crawled inside, glass crunching under his knees. He reached for the baby, his fingers struggling with the buckle. The cries were deafening, the fear in the air thick and heavy. He got the buckle loose, pulling the baby into his arms. It was so small, wrapped in a blue blanket. He backed out of the car, holding the baby close, feeling the tiny body trembling against his chest. He looked around, hoping to see someone running to help, but they all just stood there, staring. Malik's eyes went to the mansion at the end of the street. It was big, with tall gates and a fancy garden. He remembered seeing a woman with a baby there before. Maybe it was theirs. Maybe they could help. Without waiting, he started running, the baby crying in his arms, the mansion getting closer. He ignored the stairs, ignored the fear twisting in his stomach. He just knew he had to get the baby somewhere safe. He reached the gate, out of breath, his legs aching. He banged on it, shouting for help. "Hey, I got a baby here. Someone please." A man in a suit appeared, looking confused and then alarmed. He shouted something Malik couldn't hear. The gate opened and 2 security guards rushed out, blocking his way. "Stop right there!" one of them yelled. Malik skidded to a halt, panting, the baby still crying in his arms. I just need to get this baby safe," Malik said, his voice cracking. "There was an accident. I found the baby. Please." The guards looked at each other, then at Malik. One of them spoke into his radio, and a moment later, a man came out from the house. He was older, wearing an expensive-looking suit, his face a mix of fear and anger. "What's going on here?" he demanded, his eyes narrowing at Malik. "What are you doing with my child?" Malik's heart sank. He opened his mouth to explain, but the words felt stuck. The man's eyes were full of suspicion, and the guards stepped closer, their expressions hard. "I'm just trying to help," Malik said, his voice barely a whisper. The baby's cries filled the silence between them, the weight of everything pressing down on Malik's shoulders. He felt small, powerless, but he couldn't let go of the baby. Not yet. Not until he knew it was safe. The tension around Malik thickened, like a knot tightening in his chest. The security guards eyed him, their faces hard, as if ready to push him back at any moment. Mr. Hastings, the man in the suit, stepped closer, his brows furrowed as he stared at the crying baby. "Where did you come from?" Mr. Hastings barked, his eyes drilling into Malik. "What are you doing with my son?" Malik tried to steady his breath, his hands trembling as he adjusted his grip on the baby. He didn't know how to put it into words without sounding like some crazy kid. He took a shaky breath. "There was an accident," he said, his voice cracking a bit. "The car, it flipped over. Your baby was inside. I pulled him out. I'm just trying to help." Mr. Hastings seemed frozen for a moment. He looked from Malik to the baby and then back again. The guards exchanged glances, as if unsure what to do. "An accident?" Mr. Hastings repeated, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. He reached out for the baby, but Malik hesitated, feeling the tension in his shoulders. The baby was still crying, and Malik could feel the tears soaking through the blanket. He looked up at Mr. Hastings, trying to read the expression in his eyes, searching for some sign of understanding. "I'm not trying to do anything bad," Malik said, his voice urgent. "I just wanted to make sure he was safe. The driver, she wasn't moving." Mr. Hastings finally took the baby, cradling it awkwardly, his frown softening slightly as he glanced at the little face. The crying began to quiet down, and the baby let out a few hiccuping sobs, its tiny hands gripping the edge of the blanket. For a second, everything was still, as if the tension had deflated. Malik let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. He took a step back, his legs wobbly from running all the way here. He could feel the cut on his palm stinging, the blood smeared across his fingers. One of the guards must have noticed too, because his gaze dropped to Malik's hand and his eyebrows raised. "Sir," the guard said, looking at Mr. Hastings, "should we call the police?" Mr. Hastings looked up sharply, and Malik's stomach sank. His heart pounded in his ears as he shook his head. No, you don't need to call the police," he said quickly, the words tumbling out. "I swear I'm just trying to help. I heard the baby crying and—" Mr. Hastings stared at Malik for a long moment. The baby had gone quiet now, its tiny eyes blinking up at the man. He seemed to think it over, looking down at his son, then back at Malik. "Who are you?" he finally asked, his voice still carrying a hint of suspicion. "Where do you come from?" Malik swallowed hard. "My name's Malik. I live just down the street," he said, nodding his head toward the direction he'd come from. "I was near the corner when I saw it happen. The car just lost control." There was a silence that stretched out between them, awkward and heavy. One of the guards cleared his throat, looking like he was waiting for a signal from Mr. Hastings. The other guard eyed Malik cautiously, as if deciding whether to believe him. Mr. Hastings took a step back, rocking his son gently, and let out a long breath. "All right," he said, his voice calmer now. He looked Malik up and down, as if seeing him for the first time. "You look like you're hurt. Come inside, let's get that taken care of." Malik blinked, surprised. Inside? He hadn't expected that. He glanced at the guards, who seemed just as taken aback. "Yes, inside," Mr. Hastings said firmly. He turned and began to walk toward the house, the baby now resting quietly against his shoulder. He gestured for Malik to follow. "Come on." Malik hesitated only for a second before following. The guard stepped aside reluctantly, giving Malik wary looks as he walked past them. He kept his eyes forward, not wanting to provoke them. The gate closed behind him with a heavy clang that echoed in the stillness. The front yard was manicured to perfection, the bushes trimmed, the grass green and even. Malik tried not to gawk as they approached the huge house, the columns by the front door giving it an almost palace-like feel. He had never been this close to a place like this. The air smelled like flowers and fresh-cut grass, nothing like the scent of old cars and cooking that filled his neighborhood. Mr. Hastings pushed the door open and they stepped into the entryway. The floor was shiny, the walls lined with framed pictures. Malik glanced around, suddenly feeling very aware of the dirt on his shoes and the blood on his hands. "Sit down," Mr. Hastings said, nodding toward a bench by the wall. "I'll get someone to bring a first aid kit." He turned, and a woman in a uniform hurried over, taking the baby from him and disappearing into another room. Malik sat down on the bench, his legs feeling like they might give out beneath him if he stood any longer. His hand throbbed, and he tried to keep it still, not wanting to drip blood onto the floor. He looked around, hearing the muffled sounds of people talking in other rooms, the clinking of dishes from somewhere down the hall. After a few moments, Mr. Hastings came back, a small white box in his hands. He handed it to Malik. "Here, you should clean that up. You're bleeding all over the place." "Thanks," Malik said, taking the box. He opened it and pulled out a wipe, the alcohol sting making him wince as he dabbed at the cut. Mr. Hastings watched him, his face unreadable. "You said you saw the accident?" Mr. Hastings asked, crossing his arms. "What happened exactly?" Malik nodded, focusing on wrapping a bandage around his hand. "I was near the corner. I just saw the car lose control and it flipped. I think the driver was hurt. She wasn't moving, but the baby was crying and no one else was getting close, so I went in." Mr. Hastings frowned, his gaze fixed on Malik's hand as he worked. He didn't say anything for a while, just watched. Finally he spoke. "You know, most people wouldn't have done that, running toward a wreck like that. It's dangerous." Malik shrugged, not knowing what to say. "I just heard the baby," he mumbled. "I couldn't just leave it." Mr. Hastings nodded slowly, as if he was seeing Malik in a different light now. He let out a sigh, rubbing a hand over his face. "Well, you did a brave thing. Reckless, but brave." Malik gave a small smile, not sure how to respond. He finished wrapping his hand and closed the first aid kit, setting it aside. He wanted to leave, to go back home and tell his mum everything was okay, but he wasn't sure if Mr. Hastings was done with him yet. The front door opened, and a man in a police uniform walked in. Malik's heart skipped a beat, his body tensing up. He watched as the officer approached, his eyes shifting between Malik and Mr. Hastings. "Sir, we got a call about an incident here," the officer said, looking at Mr. Hastings. Mr. Hastings held up a hand. It's all right, officer. It was a misunderstanding. This young man here, he saved my son. Malik felt a rush of relief, his shoulders sagging a bit. The officer looked at him, his expression softening slightly. Is that so? Malik nodded, swallowing hard. Yes, sir. There was an accident. I just wanted to help. The officer nodded, his gaze lingering on Malik for a moment before he turned back to Mr. Hastings. All right then, if everything's under control. It is, Mr. Hastings said, giving Malik a long look. Thank you, officer. The officer gave a nod and left, the door closing behind him. Malik let out a breath, his heart still racing. Mr. Hastings looked at him for a long moment before speaking. You're free to go, Malik, he said, his voice softer now. And thank you. Really. Malik stood up, his legs feeling shaky. He gave a small nod. I'm just glad your baby's okay. Mr. Hastings watched him as he walked toward the door, the guard stepping aside to let him pass. Malik pushed the door open, stepping back outside into the warm afternoon air. He glanced back once, seeing Mr. Hastings still watching him from the doorway. Malik took a deep breath and started walking, his hand throbbing, but his heart feeling a little lighter. He knew he had done the right thing, even if it had been scary, even if for a moment he thought everything might go wrong. Malik walked back to the neighborhood with his head down, his hands tucked into his pockets. The adrenaline was starting to wear off, leaving his body feeling heavy and his thoughts disoriented. He couldn't quite believe what had just happened, how close he had come to being dragged off by the police for something he hadn't done. It was strange. Saving a baby should have made him feel proud, but instead, he just felt drained. When he turned the corner toward home, he found a group of neighbors gathered, looking toward the mansion with a mix of curiosity and concern. Mrs. Thompson, who lived 2 doors down, waved him over, her brows furrowed. Malik boy, what's going on up there? She asked, her voice full of worry. We saw you running and then the police came. You okay? Malik stopped in front of her, nodding. Yeah, Mrs. Thompson. There was an accident up the street. I tried to help. The baby, it was crying. She looked at him closely, her eyes softening when she noticed the bandage on his hand. You poor thing, you're hurt. Come on, come inside, let me get you some water. No, it's okay, Malik said quickly, shaking his head. I just need to get home. My mum will be back soon and I don't want her to worry. He forced a smile, trying to reassure her. I'm all right, really. Mrs. Thompson sighed, but she nodded. All right, but you tell your mama what happened, okay? She needs to know. Malik promised he would, though he wasn't sure how he was going to explain it without worrying her even more. The last thing his mother needed was more stress. She already had enough, working long hours, trying to keep the lights on, trying to keep them all fed. He made it home, stepping into the quiet, dim room. The electric bill notice was still lying on the counter, its bright red letters like a slap in the face. Malik picked it up, staring at it for a moment before shoving it back in his pocket. He needed a plan, something that would solve this problem. Before he could think any further, there was a knock at the door. Malik's heart skipped a beat. He wasn't expecting anyone, and a sudden unreasonable fear washed over him. Maybe the police had changed their mind. Maybe they had come to get him after all. He moved to the door slowly, opening it just a crack. His eyes widened when he saw Mr. Hastings standing there, his suit immaculate, his face serious. Malik hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to say. Mr. Hastings? Malik stammered, opening the door a little wider. What are you doing here? Mr. Hastings looked at Malik, then glanced past him into the small, dimly lit room. He cleared his throat. I wanted to speak with you, Malik. May I come in? Malik blinked, glancing around the room, embarrassed by the peeling paint on the walls, the cluttered kitchen counter. He stepped aside, holding the door open for Mr. Hastings, who entered the room slowly, his eyes scanning the surroundings. This is where you live? Mr. Hastings asked, his voice low, as if he wasn't quite sure what to say. Malik nodded, closing the door behind them. Yeah, this is home, Malik replied. He tried to ignore the heat that rose to his face, the feeling of shame that crept in when he saw Mr. Hastings' expression. Mr. Hastings looked at Malik, his eyes softening for a moment. He let out a sigh, then reached into his coat pocket, pulling out an envelope. He held it out toward Malik. Listen, I owe you a debt of gratitude for what you did today. You saved my son's life, and I don't take that lightly, Mr. Hastings said, his voice sincere. This is for you, to help your family. Please, take it. Malik stared at the envelope, his hands clenching at his sides. He could tell from the thickness of it that it held a lot of money, more money than his mother could make in months. But something inside him tightened, an unease he couldn't shake. He shook his head, taking a step back. I didn't do it for money, Mr. Hastings. I couldn't leave the baby there. I don't need a reward. Mr. Hastings looked taken aback, his hand still extended. He frowned, glancing down at the envelope. Malik, I understand, but you have to realize that what you did was extraordinary. You deserve something in return. Malik shook his head again, his voice firm this time. I just want to help my family. I don't need a reward. Just take care of your son, okay? Make sure he's safe. There was a long pause, and Malik could feel the tension between them, the weight of Mr. Hastings' expectations pressing down on him. Finally, Mr. Hastings let out a slow breath and put the envelope back in his pocket. He looked at Malik, his eyes narrowing slightly, as if trying to understand something about him. All right, Malik, Mr. Hastings said quietly. But if you ever need anything at all, you come to me, understand? Malik nodded, though he wasn't sure he ever would. He watched as Mr. Hastings turned and walked to the door, pausing for a moment before opening it. Thank you again, Malik. You're a brave young man, Mr. Hastings said, his voice almost soft. Then he was gone, the door closing behind him with a quiet click. Malik stood there for a long moment, staring at the door, the echoes of the conversation bouncing around in his head. He let out a breath, turning back to the small living room. The electric bill notice seemed to glare at him from the counter, the red letters practically glowing in the dim light. He walked over, picking it up again, feeling the weight of it like a stone in his hand. He didn't want charity. He didn't want someone else to solve his problems, but he needed a solution. He couldn't keep letting his mom struggle like this. Malik clenched the bill in his hand, making a decision. He didn't need a reward for doing the right thing, but he wasn't going to let his family sit in the dark either. Maybe Mr. Hastings could help, not with charity, but with an opportunity, a way to earn it. He shoved the bill back into his pocket and grabbed his jacket. He was going to go back to that mansion. He was going to find a way to fix this. Malik found himself standing in front of the mansion's gate once again, his heart pounding against his chest. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the immaculate lawn. He knew it was a risk coming back here, especially without being invited. But he needed to do this, for his family, for his mum, and for his siblings. He pressed the button at the gate, hearing the buzz echo through the large house beyond. A few minutes later, the gate opened, and the same security guard from earlier appeared. He looked Malik up and down, his brow furrowing. You again? The guard said, a mix of surprise and irritation in his voice. What do you want, kid? Malik swallowed, standing his ground even as he felt the weight of the guard's disapproval. I need to talk to Mr. Hastings, he said, trying to keep his voice steady. Please, it's important. The guard stared at him for a moment, then sighed, turning back toward the house. Wait here, he muttered, before disappearing beyond the gate. Malik shifted on his feet, his fingers tapping against his thigh as he waited. Every passing second made him more nervous. He couldn't help but think of what his mom would say if she knew he was here again, standing in front of a mansion that felt worlds away from the reality they lived in. The minutes dragged by, and Malik started to worry that maybe Mr. Hastings wouldn't want to see him, that maybe the man had already forgotten all about what had happened earlier. But then the front door opened, and there was Mr. Hastings, his expression unreadable. Let him in, Mr. Hastings said to the guard, who gave a small nod before stepping aside. Malik took a deep breath, stepping through the gate and making his way up the long pathway to the front door. Mr. Hastings stood there, his arms crossed, his eyes narrowing slightly as Malik approached. Malik, Mr. Hastings said, his voice even, I didn't expect to see you again so soon. Is everything all right? Malik hesitated, glancing at the grand house behind Mr. Hastings before meeting his gaze. Yeah, everything's fine. I need to talk to you. About earlier. Mr. Hastings raised an eyebrow, stepping aside to let Malik in. "Come in then. Let's talk inside." Malik followed Mr. Hastings into the house, the heavy door closing behind them. The cool air of the mansion felt strange after the warmth of the street outside. Mr. Hastings led him into a sitting room, gesturing for him to sit on one of the large, plush couches. Malik sat, trying not to sink too far into the soft cushions. Mr. Hastings remained standing, his arms still crossed. "So, what is it you need, Malik? I thought you didn't want the reward." Malik nodded, his fingers twisting together nervously. "I don't want charity, Mr. Hastings. I wanted to ask if there's any work I can do, anything at all. I need to help my mum with the bills, and I thought maybe you could give me a job. I'll do anything. I'll work hard, I promise." Mr. Hastings looked at Malik for a long moment, his expression softening slightly. He let out a slow breath, nodding. "You're a stubborn kid, you know that?" There was a hint of a smile on his lips, and he uncrossed his arms, moving to sit across from Malik. "Most people would have taken the money and left." Malik shrugged, feeling his face heat up. "My mum always says we gotta earn what we get, and I don't want her to think I'm taking handouts. She works too hard for that." Mr. Hastings nodded, his eyes thoughtful. He leaned back in his chair, tapping his fingers against the armrest. "You're an honest young man, Malik. I respect that." He paused, then gave a small sigh. "I could use some help around the property, yard work, maintenance. It's not glamorous, but it's something. If you're willing to work, I'm willing to pay." Malik's eyes widened, hope blooming in his chest. "Really? You'd give me a job?" Mr. Hastings nodded. "Yes. You can start tomorrow after school. I'll make sure the guards know to let you in." A smile spread across Malik's face, relief flooding through him. "Thank you, Mr. Hastings. I promise I'll work hard. I won't let you down." Mr. Hastings gave a small nod, his gaze softening. "I believe you, Malik." He stood, and Malik quickly got to his feet as well. Mr. Hastings walked him back to the front door, his footsteps echoing on the marble floor. "Take care of that hand," Mr. Hastings said, nodding toward Malik's bandaged palm. "And tell your mother that she's got a son to be proud of." Malik nodded, swallowing the lump that rose in his throat. "I will. Thanks again." Mr. Hastings opened the door, and Malik stepped back out into the evening air, the sky now a deep shade of blue. He walked down the pathway, the weight on his shoulders feeling just a little bit lighter. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he had a way forward. When Malik got home, the house was still quiet. His siblings wouldn't be back from their friend's house for another hour, and his mother was still at work. He pulled out the electric bill from his pocket, staring at it for a long moment before setting it on the table. He knew it wasn't fixed yet. They still had a lot of problems to deal with, and there would still be hard days ahead. But now, at least, he had a job. He could help his mum. He could make sure the lights stayed on and that they had food on the table. The door opened, and his mum walked in, her shoulders slumped, her face tired. She looked up, her eyes widening slightly when she saw Malik standing there. "Malik, what's going on? You look different," she said, her voice filled with a mix of confusion and curiosity. Malik smiled, his heart swelling with a mix of pride and relief. He walked over, wrapping his arms around her in a tight hug. His mother froze for a second, surprised, before hugging him back, her hand gently patting his head. "I got a job, Ma," Malik said, his voice a little choked. "I'm going to help you now. We're going to be okay." She pulled back, looking at him, her eyes misty. "A job? What are you talking about, Malik?" He nodded, a wide smile spreading across his face. "I saved this baby today, Ma, and the baby's dad, he gave me a job. I'll work after school. I'll help you pay the bills." His mother stared at him for a long moment, her eyes brimming with tears. Then she pulled him into another hug, her voice thick with emotion. "Oh, Malik, you're such a good boy. You're going to do great things, I know it." Malik held her tight, his chest swelling with determination. For the first time in a long time, he felt like things were going to be all right. He had done something good, and now, maybe, things were finally starting to turn around for them. The next day passed by in a blur. Malik sat in class, staring out the window, barely listening to his teacher's voice. His mind kept drifting back to the mansion, the baby's cry, the weight of Mr. Hastings's stare. But most of all, He thought about what waited for him after school, his new job. The thought filled him with both excitement and nerves. He knew this was his chance to really help his family, but he was stepping into a world completely different from anything he'd known. When the final bell rang, Malik shot up from his desk, grabbing his worn-out backpack and rushing out the door. His friends called out to him as he passed, but he only waved, his focus straight ahead. He had somewhere important to be. The walk to the mansion felt different this time. Yesterday, he had approached it with a sense of desperation. Today, it was with determination. He needed to make sure Mr. Hastings knew he wasn't just some kid from down the street. He could work hard, he could be trusted. He wasn't here for charity. When he reached the gate, the guard from yesterday was already there, waiting. He gave Malik a nod, less suspicious this time. "You're here for the work, right?" Malik nodded, trying not to let his nervousness show. "Yeah, Mr. Hastings said I could start today." The guard stepped aside, letting him in. "He's in the back garden. Follow the path. You'll find him there." Malik thanked the guard and stepped through the gate, the path crunching under his worn sneakers. He followed it around the side of the house, the tall hedges and neatly arranged flower beds guiding him. The air was filled with the smell of fresh grass, the distant sound of birds chirping. As he rounded the corner, he saw Mr. Hastings standing in the garden, talking to one of the gardeners. The man was dressed in casual clothes this time, no suit, his sleeves rolled up as he pointed to a row of flowers. The gardener nodded, glancing at Malik as he approached. Mr. Hastings turned and saw Malik, a smile forming on his face. "Malik, good to see you," he said, waving him over. "Come here. I want to introduce you to George. He handles the garden here." Malik walked over, his hands in his pockets, trying not to look too overwhelmed by the sheer size of the place. The garden seemed to stretch endlessly, rows of flowers and hedges, a fountain in the middle. It was the kind of thing he'd only seen in movies. George, the gardener, gave Malik a nod, his face lined with age but his eyes friendly. "You must be the young man Mr. Hastings told me about," he said, extending a gloved hand. "I'm George. You ready to work?" Malik nodded quickly, shaking George's hand. "Yes, sir. I'm ready." Mr. Hastings watched the two of them, his expression thoughtful. "Malik, George will show you what needs to be done. It's not glamorous work, mostly pulling weeds, trimming, that sort of thing. But if you work hard, there could be more for you here. Understood?" "Yes, sir," Malik replied, his voice firm. He wanted to make sure Mr. Hastings knew he was serious. "Good," Mr. Hastings said, clapping a hand on Malik's shoulder. "I'll leave you to it then. George will show you the ropes. And Malik," he paused, his eyes locking on Malik's. "Thank you for coming back. It means a lot." Malik nodded, feeling a warmth spread through his chest. "Thank you for giving me a chance." Mr. Hastings turned and walked away, leaving Malik alone with George. George gave Malik a quick smile and gestured for him to follow. They walked deeper into the garden, the sound of the fountain growing louder. "All right, kid, it's pretty simple stuff," George said, handing Malik a pair of gloves. "We're going to start with these weeds here. Just pull them up. Make sure you get the roots, otherwise they'll just come back." Malik pulled on the gloves, crouching down beside George. He started pulling the weeds, the dirt sticking to his fingers even through the gloves. The work was harder than he expected, his fingers aching as he tugged at the stubborn roots, but he kept going, not wanting to disappoint. "So," George said after a while, his voice casual, "you saved Mr. Hastings' kid, huh?" Malik looked up, surprised. He hadn't expected George to bring it up. "Yeah," he said slowly. "There was an accident. The car flipped, and I heard the baby crying. I couldn't leave it." George nodded, a smile tugging at his lips. "That was brave of you. Not many people would run toward danger like that." Malik shrugged, pulling another weed, his fingers straining. "It just felt like the right thing to do. I didn't really think about it." George looked at Malik for a moment, then nodded again. "That's what makes it brave, kid. Doing it without thinking, just because it's right." He patted Malik on the shoulder before standing up, stretching his back. "All right, let's get these clippings over to the compost." Malik picked up the pile of weeds he'd gathered, following George across the garden. As they walked, Malik glanced around, taking in the neat rows of flowers, the perfectly manicured hedges. It felt like a different world, one that seemed impossibly far away from the cramped apartment where he lived. They reached the compost pile, and Malik dumped the weeds, dusting off his gloves. George leaned against the fence, watching him. "You know, kid, Mr. Hastings doesn't let just anyone work here," he said. "He's picky about who he trusts." Malik frowned, looking at George. "Why's that?" George shrugged. "It's just the way he is. He's got money, and people with money usually have to be careful. But you've already proven yourself to him. That's something." Malik nodded, the weight of George's words sinking in. He hadn't really thought about it like that. He'd been too focused on what he needed to do, how to help his mom, how to make sure his siblings were okay. But now, standing here, he realized just how much Mr. Hastings's trust meant. "Thanks, George," Malik said quietly. "I won't let him down, I promise." George smiled, pushing off the fence. "I believe you, kid. Now come on, we've got more work to do." They worked until the sun started to dip below the horizon, the sky turning shades of orange and pink. Malik's arms were sore, his back aching, but he felt good. The kind of tired that came from doing something that mattered. George clapped him on the back when they were done, nodding in approval. "Not bad for your first day, Malik. You come back tomorrow and we'll pick up where we left off." Malik grinned, wiping the sweat from his forehead. "I'll be here." "Thanks, George." He walked back down the long path, the mansion glowing behind him in the evening light. He felt a sense of pride in his chest, a feeling he hadn't had in a long time. He was doing something good, something real. He was earning it. When he got home, his mum was in the kitchen stirring a pot of soup, the smell filling the small apartment. She looked up when he walked in, her eyes lighting up when she saw him. "There's my hard-working boy," she said, her voice filled with warmth. "How was your first day?" Malik dropped his backpack by the door, walking over to hug her from behind. He rested his head on her shoulder, closing his eyes for a moment, taking in the familiar smell of home. "It was good, Ma. It was really good." She turned her head to look at him, her eyes soft, a smile on her lips. "I'm proud of you, Malik. You're doing great things." Malik nodded, his chest swelling with a mix of emotion. He knew it was just the beginning. There would be more hard days ahead, more challenges to face, but now he had hope. He had a way forward, and that was enough. The next few days settled into a rhythm. Malik would get up early, help his siblings get ready for school, and then head off to classes himself. After school, he'd walk to the mansion, where George would be waiting to give him his next set of tasks. He pulled weeds, raked leaves, carried heavy bags of mulch, and trimmed the hedges, all under George's watchful eye. It was hard work, but Malik found himself enjoying it. He liked the feeling of doing something with his hands, seeing the immediate result of his efforts. By the end of each day, he was exhausted, but it was a good kind of tired. One afternoon, after about a week of working in the garden, Mr. Hastings approached while Malik was trimming a hedge. He was dressed in his usual suit, but his expression was softer now, less intimidating. "Malik, how's it going?" Mr. Hastings asked, nodding at the hedge Malik was working on. Malik turned, wiping the sweat from his forehead. "It's going well, sir. George has been showing me how to do things right." Mr. Hastings nodded, glancing over at George, who was working a few feet away. "George tells me you're a fast learner, that you're not afraid of hard work." Malik smiled a little shyly. "I'm trying, sir." Mr. Hastings looked at him for a moment, then gestured toward the mansion. "Come with me for a minute. I'd like to talk to you about something." Malik hesitated, glancing at George, who gave him a nod. "Go on, kid. I'll take care of this." Malik put down the hedge trimmers, following Mr. Hastings toward the house. They walked around to the back door, stepping into the kitchen. Malik had never been inside this part of the mansion before. It was spacious, the counters shiny and clean, the smell of something cooking filling the air. A woman in a uniform was stirring a pot at the stove, and she gave Mr. Hastings a quick nod before turning back to her work. "Sit," Mr. Hastings said, gesturing to a small table in the corner of the kitchen. Malik sat down, his hands resting on his knees, not sure what to expect. Mr. Hastings sat across from him, folding his hands on the table. For a moment he didn't say anything, just studied Malik. Then, finally he spoke. "You know, Malik, I've been thinking a lot about what happened the day you saved my son," Mr. Hastings said, his voice thoughtful. And I realized that what you did, it wasn't just brave, it was selfless. You risked everything to save someone you didn't even know. Malik shrugged, feeling a little embarrassed. I just did what I thought was right, sir. Mr. Hastings nodded. I know, but I want you to understand something. People like you, people who do the right thing even when it's hard, they're rare. And I want to make sure that you have every opportunity you deserve. Malik frowned slightly, not sure where Mr. Hastings was going with this. He waited, his hands still on his knees. Mr. Hastings reached into his pocket, pulling out a small envelope. He set it on the table in front of Malik. This isn't charity, Malik, he said, his voice firm. This is an opportunity. I want you to take this money and use it to help your family, to pay the bills, to buy whatever you need. And I want you to know that this is just the beginning. If you keep working hard, there could be more opportunities for you here. Malik stared at the envelope, the weight of Mr. Hastings' words sinking in. He could feel his heart pounding, his throat tightening. He wanted to say no, to tell Mr. Hastings that he didn't need the money, that he could do it on his own. But then he thought about his mum, about the electric bill, about the way her shoulders slumped after a long day of work. He thought about his siblings and how they deserved a little bit of lightness in their lives. Malik swallowed, looking up at Mr. Hastings. Thank you, sir, he said quietly. I'll use it to help my family. Mr. Hastings smiled, a genuine warmth in his eyes. I know you will. And remember, Malik, if you ever need anything, you come to me, all right? Malik nodded, his voice barely a whisper. All right. Mr. Hastings stood, patting Malik on the shoulder. Good. Now go on back out there. I'm sure George has more work for you. Malik stood, taking the envelope and tucking it carefully into his pocket. He turned and walked back out to the garden, his mind spinning with everything that had just happened. He felt a strange mix of emotions, gratitude, relief, but also a sense of weight, like the responsibility had grown even heavier. When he reached George, the old gardener looked at him, his eyebrows raised. Everything all right, kid? Malik nodded, a small smile on his lips. Yeah, everything's good. George eyed him for a moment, then nodded. All right then, let's get back to work. They worked in silence for the next hour, the sun beginning to dip lower in the sky. Malik focused on the tasks George gave him, his mind drifting back to the envelope in his pocket. He hadn't looked inside yet, but he could feel the importance of it, the difference it would make for his family. When the work was done for the day, George clapped Malik on the shoulder. You did good today, Malik. You're getting better at this. Malik smiled, the tiredness in his muscles feeling like a badge of honor. Thanks, George. I'll see you tomorrow. George nodded, watching as Malik walked away, back down the path toward the gate. As Malik left the mansion grounds, he took the envelope out of his pocket, holding it in his hand. He didn't open it until he was halfway home, the streetlights flickering on above him. He carefully tore it open, his breath catching when he saw the bills inside. There was more money than he had ever seen in one place, enough to pay the electric bill, and then some. Enough to give his mum a break, to let her rest a little without worrying about how they would make it to the end of the month. Malik swallowed, his eyes stinging. He closed the envelope, slipping it back into his pocket. He knew what he had to do. He had to make sure his family was okay. He had to make sure they had what they needed. When he got home, his mum was sitting at the kitchen table, her face tired, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea. She looked up when Malik walked in, her eyes widening slightly when she saw the look on his face. Malik? What is it? She asked, her voice soft, concerned. Malik walked over, pulling the envelope from his pocket. He set it on the table in front of her, his hands trembling slightly. Mr. Hastings gave me this, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. He said it's not charity. He said it's for us. To help. His mum stared at the envelope, her eyes filling with tears. She looked up at Malik, her voice breaking. Malik, are you sure? Malik nodded, his chest tightening. Yes, Ma, it's for us. We can pay the bills. We can make it. She reached out, taking his hand, her fingers squeezing his tightly. Oh, Malik, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. You're such a good boy. You're doing so much for us. I'm so proud of you. Malik swallowed, his eyes stinging. He wrapped his arms around his mum, holding her tight, feeling the weight of everything they had been through and the hope for what was to come. He knew it wasn't over. They still had a long way to go. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like they had a chance. And that was enough. Malik woke up the next morning to the sound of birds outside his window, the early light filtering through the worn curtains. He blinked, letting his eyes adjust to the day, and glanced over at his siblings still fast asleep on the other side of the room. It took a moment for everything from the past few days to come rushing back. The job, Mr. Hastings, the envelope of money that now sat on the kitchen table. He rolled out of bed carefully, trying not to wake Kareem, who was curled up under a blanket, his thumb halfway to his mouth. Malik smiled at his little brother, then slipped out of the room and into the kitchen. His mom was already up, of course. She always was. She sat at the kitchen table, the envelope open in front of her, her fingers brushing over the bills as if she still couldn't quite believe they were real. She looked up when Malik walked in, giving him a soft, tired smile. "Morning, sweetheart," she said, her voice quiet. She gestured to the bills. "I still can't believe this. I called the electric company last night. They said we're all set. No more notices." Malik felt a warmth spread through his chest, a sense of pride swelling up. He walked over, sitting down beside her. "That's good, Ma. We're going to be okay." His mom reached over, brushing a hand over his head, her eyes glistening. "You did this, Malik. I don't know what we'd do without you." He swallowed, a tightness forming in his throat. He didn't know what to say, so he just nodded, his eyes dropping to the table. After a moment he stood, his mind shifting to the day ahead. He had to get his siblings ready, and then he had to get to school. And after that, there was work at the mansion. He moved around the small kitchen, putting bread in the toaster, filling cups with the last of the milk. His mum watched him, her eyes following his every move. "Malik," she said after a moment, her voice soft. He paused, turning to look at her. She hesitated, then smiled. "You know you don't have to do everything by yourself, right? I'm here too. We're a team." Malik nodded, giving her a small smile. "I know, Ma, but I want to help. You do so much for us. This is my way of giving back." She nodded, her eyes still glistening. "Just don't forget you're still a kid too, okay? You deserve to have some fun." He smiled, though he wasn't sure he knew what fun looked like anymore. He finished making breakfast, then went to wake his siblings, their sleepy faces lighting up at the sight of food on the table. They ate quickly, Malik making sure they were ready for school before walking them to the gate. The walk to school was the same as always, old cars rumbling by, neighbors chatting on their porches, the smell of cooking and the noise of the street filling the air. Malik held Kareem's hand, Amina walking on his other side. She looked up at him, her eyes wide. "Are you going to the big house again today, Malik?" she asked, her voice full of curiosity. Malik nodded, giving her a small smile. "Yeah, I'll be working in the garden again. Mr. Hastings said I'm doing a good job." Amina's eyes widened even more. "Are you going to work there forever?" Malik chuckled. "Maybe not forever, Amina, but for now, yeah, it's a good job." Kareem looked up at him, his small voice barely audible. "Will they let us come see you there?" Malik paused, glancing down at his brother's hopeful face. He gave him a soft smile, squeezing his hand. "Maybe one day. But for now, you just focus on school, okay?" They reached the gate of the school, and Malik knelt down, giving each of them a hug. "Be good today. Listen to your teachers," he said, his voice firm but gentle. They nodded, giving him quick smiles before running off, their backpacks bouncing. Malik watched them go, a sense of warmth in his chest. He knew they were counting on him, and he wasn't going to let them down. After school, Malik made his way back to the mansion, his backpack bouncing against his shoulders. The guard at the gate gave him a nod as he approached, stepping aside to let him in. Malik smiled, the path to the garden now familiar under his feet. George was already in the garden, a wheelbarrow full of mulch in front of him. He waved Malik over, a smile on his face. "There you are, kid. Ready to get back to it?" Malik nodded, pulling on his gloves. "Yeah, let's do it." They worked in silence for a while, George showing Malik how to spread the mulch evenly around the flower beds. The sun was warm, and Malik could feel the sweat beading on his forehead, but he didn't mind. There was something satisfying about the work, something that made him feel like he was doing something worthwhile. After a while, George straightened, wiping his brow. He looked over at Malik, a thoughtful expression on his face. "You know, kid, you've been doing a great job here. I've seen a lot of workers come and go, but you've got something special." Malik paused, looking up at George. "What do you mean?" George smiled, leaning on his rake. "You've got heart, Malik. You care about what you do. That's not something you see every day." Malik felt his face heat up, and he looked down at the ground, not sure how to respond. "Thanks, George. I want to do a good job." George nodded, his smile widening. "Well, you're doing more than that. You're making a difference here, and I think Mr. Hastings sees that too." Malik glanced over at the mansion, the windows gleaming in the afternoon sun. He wondered if Mr. Hastings really thought that, if he really saw something in Malik worth investing in. He hoped so. He wanted to prove himself not just for his family, but for himself too. As the sun started to set, George clapped Malik on the shoulder. "That's enough for today, kid. Go on home. I'll see you tomorrow." Malik nodded, taking off his gloves and wiping his hands on his jeans. He picked up his backpack, giving George a wave as he walked down the path. The mansion loomed behind him, the fountain still trickling in the garden, the smell of flowers filling the air. It felt like a different world, one he was only just starting to understand. When he got home, his mum was in the living room, Amina and Kareem sitting on the floor with their school books. Malik dropped his backpack by the door, walking over to the table where the electric bill had once sat. It was gone now, replaced by the receipt his mum had gotten after making the payment. He picked it up, staring at it for a long moment. It was just a piece of paper, but it represented so much more. It was proof that they were okay, that he was doing something that mattered. He set it back on the table, his heart swelling with a mix of pride and determination. "Malik?" His mum's voice broke into his thoughts. He turned, looking at her, the tired lines on her face softening as she smiled at him. "Dinner's almost ready. Come sit." Malik walked over, sitting down beside his mum, Amina and Kareem looking up at him with wide eyes. He knew that there would still be hard days ahead, that there would still be bills to pay and struggles to face. But right now, in this moment, everything felt right. Malik's days fell into a steady pattern after that, and each day seemed to blend into the next. He woke early, took care of his siblings, went to school, and then worked in Mr. Hastings's garden until the evening. It was a routine that kept him busy, but it also gave him a sense of purpose, something he hadn't had in a long time. One Thursday afternoon, after finishing his tasks for the day, George patted Malik on the back, giving him a grin. "You've got a visitor, kid," he said, nodding toward the house. Malik turned, confused, and saw Mr. Hastings coming down the path, holding something in his hand. Mr. Hastings smiled as he approached, holding out a small box wrapped in blue paper. "Malik, this is for you," he said. "It's not much, just a token of appreciation for the hard work you've been doing." Malik took the box, his eyes widening slightly. He wasn't used to receiving gifts, certainly not from someone like Mr. Hastings. He looked up at the man, his voice quiet. "Thank you, sir. You didn't have to." Mr. Hastings shook his head, his expression kind. "I wanted to. You've earned it." Malik nodded, carefully unwrapping the box. Inside he found a set of brand new books, children's books with colorful covers and pictures of animals and stories. He blinked, surprised, looking up at Mr. Hastings. "These are for your brother and sister," Mr. Hastings explained, his voice soft. "I know they mean a lot to you, and I thought they might like these." Malik felt a lump rise in his throat. He wasn't used to people doing things for him, at least not things that were thoughtful, that showed they truly cared. He swallowed, his voice thick. "They'll love them, sir. Thank you." Mr. Hastings smiled, reaching out to pat Malik on the shoulder. "You're a good kid, Malik. Keep doing what you're doing. You're making a difference, not just for your family, but for people like me too." Malik nodded, his chest swelling with a mix of emotions. He watched as Mr. Hastings turned and walked back to the house, leaving him with the books. He held them carefully, looking down at the colorful covers. He knew his siblings would be overjoyed. They'd never had books like these before, new, shiny, untouched. When Malik got home that evening, his mum was busy cooking dinner, the smell of stew filling the small apartment. Amina and Kareem were sitting at the kitchen table doing their homework, their pencils moving across the paper. Malik walked in, setting his backpack on the floor and holding the books behind his back. Amina looked up, her eyes brightening when she saw him. "Malik, you're home!" He smiled, walking over to the table. "I've got something for you guys," he said, his voice a little teasing. Amina's eyes widened, and she sat up straighter, curiosity lighting up her face. "What is it?" Malik slowly brought the books out from behind his back, setting them on the table in front of her. "These are for you and Kareem. Mr. Hastings gave them to me for you." Amina gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. She reached out, her fingers brushing over the covers, her eyes wide with wonder. "They're so pretty," she whispered. "Are they really for us?" Malik nodded, his smile growing. "Yeah, they're all yours. You can read them tonight if you want." Kareem leaned over, his eyes wide as he looked at the books. He carefully picked one up, turning it over in his small hands. "I've never had a book like this," he said, his voice filled with awe. Their mum turned from the stove, her eyes softening as she saw the books on the table. She walked over, her hand resting on Malik's shoulder. "What's all this, Malik?" she asked, her voice gentle. "Mr. Hastings gave them to me," Malik explained, looking up at her. "He said they're for Amina and Kareem. He thought they might like them." His mum looked at the books, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. She reached out, her fingers brushing over the covers, and then she looked at Malik, her smile filled with emotion. "You're bringing so much good to this family, Malik. You're giving them things I never could." Malik swallowed, his throat tightening. He shook his head. "We're all doing our part, Ma. I'm just trying to help." She pulled him into a hug, her arms wrapped tightly around him. He could feel the warmth of her love, the pride in her embrace. "You're doing more than helping, Malik. You're giving us hope. You're showing us that things can get better." He held her tight, his eyes closing as he let the moment sink in. He knew it wasn't just about the books or the money for the bills. It was about the feeling of hope that had begun to bloom in their small apartment. A hope that they could make it, that they could find a way to be okay. The next day at the mansion, Malik was back at work, raking leaves in the garden. George was nearby, trimming a row of hedges, and they worked in companionable silence, the sun shining overhead. As they worked, Malik noticed something he hadn't seen before. Mr. Hastings was standing by the back door of the mansion, talking to a group of people. People who looked like they were from the neighborhood, their clothes worn, their expressions a mix of curiosity and uncertainty. George looked up, following Malik's gaze, and he smiled. "Looks like Mr. Hastings is opening up his doors a bit, huh?" Malik frowned, setting his rake down. "What do you mean?" George nodded toward the group. "He's been reaching out to people in the neighborhood, trying to help them, just like he helped you. I think you inspired him, kid." Malik blinked, his eyes widening slightly. He watched as Mr. Hastings shook hands with one of the men, his expression open and kind. It was a side of Mr. Hastings that Malik hadn't really seen before, a side that was willing to give, not just money, but time and understanding. "He's really doing that?" Malik asked, his voice quiet, almost disbelieving. George nodded. "Yep. He said he wants to help out more, make a difference for people who need it. And I think you're the reason why, Malik. You showed him that there's more to people than what they see on the surface." Malik felt a strange sense of pride swell in his chest, his throat tightening. He looked back at Mr. Hastings, watching as he spoke to the people from the neighborhood, his face filled with sincerity. He'd never thought that what he did, saving that baby, working hard in the garden, could ripple out like this. Could make someone like Mr. Hastings see the world differently, could inspire him to help others. But here it was, happening right in front of him. When Malik got home that night, he found his mum sitting at the kitchen table, the books spread out in front of her. Amina was sitting in her lap, pointing at the pictures, her voice excited as she tried to read the words. Kareem was beside them, his eyes glued to the pages, his small hands resting on the table. They looked up when Malik walked in, their faces lighting up. "Malik," Amina said, her voice full of joy. "Look, we're reading the book you got us." He smiled, walking over and sitting down beside them. What's the story about? Amina's eyes sparkled, her voice eager. It's about a bear who gets lost in the woods, but then he finds his way home, just like you found your way home to us. Malik felt his chest tighten, his eyes stinging. He reached out, ruffling her hair. That's right, Amina. We all find our way home. He looked at his mum, her eyes glistening with unshed tears, her smile soft. They were going to be okay, and he was going to make sure of it. The next morning, Malik woke up early, the first rays of sunlight streaming through the curtains. He took a deep breath, feeling the cool air against his face. Today was going to be different. Today, something felt new, like the start of a new chapter. It was a feeling that made his heart beat just a bit faster, a mix of excitement and determination. He moved quietly around the apartment, careful not to wake his siblings. His mother was already up, of course, standing by the stove, her back to him as she stirred a pot of oatmeal. He walked over, wrapping his arms around her waist, pressing his cheek against her back. "Good morning, Ma," he said, his voice still sleepy. She turned her head slightly, giving him a smile over her shoulder. "Good morning, sweetheart, you're up early." He nodded, pulling away to help her set the table. "I've got a lot to do today." His mum turned, her brow furrowed, her eyes searching his face. "You okay, Malik? You seem different." Malik smiled, nodding. "Yeah, Ma, I'm more than okay. I feel good." She studied him for a moment longer, then nodded, her smile growing. "Well, that's all a mother could hope for." After they finished breakfast, Malik walked his siblings to school, the two of them chatting excitedly about the books they had read the night before. Amina couldn't stop talking about the bear in the story, her small hand gripping Malik's tightly as she described each part of the tale with enthusiasm. At the school gate, Kareem clung to Malik's leg, looking up at him with wide eyes. "Are you going to work today, Malik?" he asked. Malik knelt down, giving Kareem a hug. "Yeah, I'm going to work, but I'll be home in time for dinner. Maybe we can read another story tonight." Kareem smiled, nodding quickly. "Yeah, can we read the one about the forest animals?" Malik nodded, ruffling Kareem's hair. "You got it, little man. I'll see you later, okay?" He gave Amina a hug, watching as they walked through the school gate, Kareem holding Amina's hand. He stayed there for a moment, watching them disappear into the building, a sense of warmth spreading through him. That afternoon after school, Malik made his way back to the mansion, his backpack bouncing against his shoulders. The sky was overcast, a cool breeze blowing through the streets. When he reached the gate, the guard gave him a nod, stepping aside to let him in. Malik walked down the path, the familiar garden coming into view. George was already there, his hands deep in a flower bed pulling out weeds. He looked up when he saw Malik, giving him a grin. "There you are, kid," George said. "I was beginning to think you weren't coming today." Malik dropped his backpack on the ground, pulling on his gloves. "I wouldn't miss it, George. What do we have to do today?" George nodded toward the flower beds. "We've got to finish weeding these, then we need to lay down some new mulch. Think you can handle that?" Malik smiled, nodding. "Of course." They worked side by side for a while, the sounds of the garden filling the air, the rustling of leaves, the distant sound of birds chirping. Malik liked the quiet of the garden. It gave him time to think, to process everything that had happened in the past few weeks. As they were finishing up, Malik heard footsteps behind him. He turned, surprised to see Mr. Hastings walking toward them, a man in a dark suit beside him. Mr. Hastings smiled at Malik, giving him a nod. "Malik, I'm glad you're here," Mr. Hastings said, gesturing to the man beside him. "This is Mr. Carter. He works with me, and we've been talking about something that I think you might be interested in." Malik frowned, glancing at Mr. Carter. The man smiled, his expression friendly. "Hello, Malik," he said, his voice calm. "I've heard a lot about you. Mr. Hastings has been telling me how hard you've been working here, and how much of a difference you've made." Malik felt his face heat up, and he glanced at George, who gave him an encouraging nod. Thank you, sir," Malik said, unsure of what else to say. Mr. Hastings stepped forward, his eyes locking onto Malik's. "Malik, Mr. Carter is part of a program that helps young people like you get access to more opportunities. Better education, mentorship, things that could help you in the future. I spoke to him about you, and he thinks you'd be a perfect fit for the program." Malik blinked, his heart pounding in his chest. "A program? What do you mean?" Mr. Carter stepped forward, his smile widening. "It's an after-school program, Malik. It's designed to help kids with potential, kids who want to do more, who want to learn and grow. We provide tutoring, activities, even career guidance, and Mr. Hastings thinks you'd be a perfect candidate." Malik stared at them, his mind racing. He hadn't expected this. He had been happy just working here, just helping his mom and making sure his siblings had what they needed. But this was something he hadn't even dared to hope for. He looked at Mr. Hastings, his voice barely above a whisper. "You really think I can do it, sir?" Mr. Hastings nodded, his expression sincere. "I know you can, Malik. You're one of the hardest working young men I've ever met. You deserve every opportunity to succeed." Malik swallowed, his throat tight. He turned to look at George, who was watching him with a proud smile. George gave him a nod, his voice gruff. "You've got this, kid. Go for it." Malik took a deep breath, his heart pounding. He turned back to Mr. Carter, his voice steady. "I'd like to join the program, sir. I want to do whatever I can to learn more, to help my family." Mr. Carter smiled, reaching out to shake Malik's hand. "That's the spirit, Malik. We'll get you all signed up, and I think you're going to do great." Mr. Hastings clapped a hand on Malik's shoulder, his smile warm. "I'm proud of you, Malik. You've come a long way." Malik nodded, feeling a swell of emotion in his chest. He knew this was a chance, one that not many people got. He was going to take it, and he was going to make the most of it. When Malik got home that evening, his mom was sitting at the table, Kareem and Amina beside her, their books spread out in front of them. She looked up when Malik walked in, her eyes lighting up. "There's my boy," she said, her voice filled with warmth. "How was work today?" Malik walked over, setting his backpack down and sitting beside her. He took a deep breath, looking at his mom, his voice filled with emotion. "Ma, something amazing happened today. Mr. Hastings, he got me into this program. It's going to help me with school, with everything." His mom stared at him, her eyes widening, her hands covering her mouth. "A program? Malik, what do you mean?" Malik nodded, his smile growing. "It's an after-school program, Ma. They're going to help me learn more, get ready for the future. It's going to help us." Tears filled his mom's eyes, and she reached out, pulling Malik into a tight hug. "Oh, Malik, I knew you were destined for great things. I knew it." Amina and Kareem looked up at him, their eyes wide. "Does this mean you're going to be a teacher, Malik?" Amina asked, her voice filled with awe. Malik laughed, shaking his head. "I don't know, Amina. Maybe one day. But right now it just means I'm going to learn more, so I can help you guys even more." Kareem grinned, wrapping his small arms around Malik's neck. "You're the best brother ever, Malik." Malik hugged his brother tight, his chest swelling with a mix of pride and determination. He knew that things weren't going to magically be easy from now on. There would still be bills to pay, still be long days of work, still be moments of struggle. But now there was also hope, a real solid hope that things could be different, that he could make a better future for himself, for his family. He looked at his mom, her smile filled with pride, her eyes still glistening with tears. He looked at his siblings, their faces filled with joy, with belief in him. And he knew, deep in his heart, that he was ready for whatever came next. He was ready to face it all, to keep moving forward, to keep fighting for them, and that, more than anything, was enough.